Well, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Total Traffic and Conversion, and with Betty Withrow and myself, Greg Dixon, and we have guests Zac Jarrard and Joe Bellissimo. I hope I don't mispronounce that. Oh, we have a new guest just popping in right now at the at the moment, Douglas Wood. So there we go. We have quite the crowd here today. And a few weeks ago, we had Zac was on the show, and Zac and Douglas have been working on a book, working in the gamification area for a long time. We had a really interesting discussion with Zac with gamification in the context of marketing. And today we're going to talk about how gamification can bridge generations or across generations. So um, I'm I, I'm as curious as anybody else about what that will look like. So, Zac, do you want to introduce you and Doug?
Sure, I'll go on ahead and start, and thank you. So, my name's Zac Jarrard, and I'm the president of Jarrard Consulting LLC. We work to bring out the best in people through offering team building activities with games, project management, training, and then workshops to improve interactions across generations. And I can say, in terms of games, if you look throughout history, all generations have played games at some point. If you go even to prehistoric humans, they played what we know today as dominoes. They would stack bones together and knock them down or whatnot. Kings and queens and people in India would play chess. And even if you look today, there's games everywhere. And I think it's a great tool to connect the different generations that we've got. And as Greg had mentioned, I brought Doug here today. He's one of my other colleagues in Kansas City, and we're both working on a book together, which we're real excited to talk a little bit about today. So I think I'll go on ahead and let Doug introduce himself.
Okay, thank you, Zac. Zac and I have been working together in this book for I don't know, number of months now. What I think is interesting is that very often when you talk about generational work, you're dealing with people of one generation or another generation. Zac and I belong to different generations. Okay, and so we work together. One of the things we share is Zac and I both really do enjoy games of all types. And, there's a feeling in some organizations that there's no room for games in our organization, right? We have a serious job to do, and we have to focus on this. And as an engineer, I've heard it. The problem is that games are how you know people. Okay, it is how you get to know people. In bygone days, you would get folks together for sort of a mixer, and they would get together in a party, and they'd probably drink alcoholic beverages, and they would the idea was they get to know each other. Unfortunately, you don't really get to know people that way. You get to know their drunken selves. The younger people today don't drink as much. That's well established. But what do? Well, they play games with each other. Now, the old games, dominoes, as he mentioned, chess and checkers, and even horrible games like Monopoly, are generally played in a face-to-face environment. But the gaming online today is so many times larger. And I think part of that is it enables you to go quickly to people who share your interests and might be anywhere in the world. Well, isn't that what our organizations do today? Aren't we working across boundaries? Just this podcast here, we're all in different cities. So if we move the idea of games away from physical presence, and if we move the idea of games from, well, I'll only play with people of my generation, I think it enhances the ability for your organizations to truly build a functioning culture. Did I say it right, Zac?
Yep, you were spot on. And I should also add, so Doug is the president of DC Wood Consulting, and he works with transactional businesses, not-for-profits, and organizations to help them better understand cost of quality management, leadership, and so much more. And believe it or not, he's an international expert in cost of quality, which I've never met before until I met him. And I've gotten to know him over the years, and he's just incredible and a whole lot of fun to work with, and especially on our book. I'm truly honored to be co-authoring this with him.
Yeah, Zac allows me to pull out of the technical background that I have, and brings me into more of a culture function. But we do enjoy this. So the question of, how does this fit? Why is this important? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we're facing here.
Yeah. So do we want to open it up to some questions here, Betty? What do you have a comment, or what would you like to say at this point?
Well, as you know, Greg, I'm all about communication, and what do different groups of people find to be important is my favorite topic in the world. So I think we're right in the right ballpark here, because clearly there's a difference in priorities between the generations. As Doug pointed out, there's a lot less drinking going on among the younger people, which is great. And this style of communication of each one of the generations is different. But when you have a game forms a sort of a common language in between the different mindsets, if you like. So you have tokens that move around, and they have a different meaning for each person in their own personal context and their mental environment. And yet you're synthesizing a new level of understanding and programming, if you like, by that. So that is really cool. I like that. Yeah. And, the talk about chess reminds me of my two older sons, and actually my youngest son too, all got really into chess as kids because of those very same things. And for instance, getting into a chess match with someone from a different culture, because I used to drag the kids all over the place outside of into other countries and things. You don't even need to speak the same language. You're just there moving the pieces around, and the minds are interacting in different ways. Mm-hmm. So that's another benefit, is it's transcends the language factor in terms of, it's not a verbal environment. It's a mental construct environment, which is, again, that's incredibly cool.
Right. Well, and especially if you look today at millennials, Generation Z, Generation Alpha, in a couple of years, soon to be Generation Beta. So the kids of Generation Z that do not exist yet, they've spent most of their lives in these interactive online environments. And believe it or not, they're learning a whole bunch of skills from playing a lot of these games. They're taking leadership roles. They're building vast digital spaces. Something Doug didn't mention, he plays video games too. He's played City Skylines, so a game where you manage a city and the various complexities of it. And I've also taught him how to play Minecraft. And one example I could think of is we built a pyramid together. So Doug really likes to use Excel and spreadsheets and data. And so he actually mapped out how many blocks we would need to build a replica of the pyramids in Egypt. And so we did that together in a virtual space. Now, if you go back in the past, pre-internet, that wouldn't have been possible. Mm-hmm. Even our broadcast today, for all of us being in different cities, we would have had to go to like a TV station or somewhere more, expensive and sophisticated. Right. But I think there's opportunities, though, with a lot of these virtual spaces and technology to help bridge the gaps between generations, and especially lean on the generations that are comfortable or used to being in these environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it really is, uh, in terms of planetary development, it's a new language that's being evolved.
Mhm.
The internet environment and the overcoming and the transcending of distance in our minds. I mean, scientifically, it's shown that as we're interacting on this screen, our bodies are interacting with one another as well across the distances. Our minds are connecting. And so new kinds of language are being created every day as we move forward, and expanding, particularly the entrepreneurial environment, is really pushing us to learn faster and more efficient ways to get a concept across. And I think that's,
You know,
we need to think that way.
yeah. If, just thinking about this, realizing how is it that people used to, share knowledge and share thoughts and communicate across large distances, and the pipelines were narrow, right? You could write an article and maybe they'd read it. You if you were within an organization, say a big multinational company, they knew that communication took an entire department. So usually what would happen is the communication, the ideas, the discussion would go up the pipeline, it would cross over, and then it would come down, in the other department, which of course, you know what happens to that. The message just gets garbled. But this virtual environment enables people at all levels to communicate directly with one another, and using a game environment, it's non-threatening. It enables you to talk to people with a common interest, or build a new interest. And so this, as you said, Betty, this is a whole new language.
Yeah, it is, and that is how languages evolve. There's a need to get something from one mind to another, and what's the most efficient way of doing that? For example, cultures in the South Pacific that spend most of their lives on boats communicate in many cases by drums. Before even having radios or anything, drumming and information passed through a known group of signals. Is another example of filling a need in a specific environment. For those people, having a radio isn't necessarily the most efficient thing, although they have them now. But it is a new language, and we get to be part of creating it. It was very exciting.
Right. I think you're spot on. And even, looking beyond games, just at some of the technology we have, to give another example. So Doug Wood and I were both in the American Society for Quality. It's a group geared toward manufacturing and quality professionals. And we're both a part of a group in there called the Quality Management Division. Mm-hmm. They have over 22,000 members worldwide. And a long time ago, they used to do conferences at various places. And oftentimes those would get expensive, getting everyone face-to-face for a certain number of days. And so the Quality Management Division team worked with Doug to set up a webinar series. And so once or twice a month, they'll put on webinars from people that are from all over the world, from Asia, Europe, the US, everywhere. And Doug does an incredible job moderating these with his team. But just goes to show you, from using that technology, you're able to make all these new connections with people from different age groups and backgrounds, but then also expand your reach. So instead of getting all those 22,000 people in one place face to face, you can use a webinar and connect them all in a virtual way.
Yeah.
One of the things we just did last month was, he says 22,000 members. We held a town hall meeting using WebEx. This was not a webinar where we're explaining something, with a speaker explaining things. This is where we had 60 people. They all got online, we held a breakout session, because you can do that with these tools. And they all went into different sessions, and each group discussed what they were doing, and then they came back again. So, we weren't using a game. Okay. We were just getting people in the same space. But I think the idea of using gaming in an environment with these people would be an extremely powerful technique. So I'll tell you, I've worked with Zac on at least one of these game environments, right? And the key role there is that of the moderator. Okay, being able to ask questions of people. Zac is excellent at this. To ask people, well, what are you thinking, and where are you going with that? And he starts with a kind of a guide, a direction, and then by having the conversations, again, in these environments, everybody hears everybody else. Okay, and you've got a character that you've created that's running around. Okay, and so you can hear each other, you can talk to each other. And the moderator then asks questions pertinent to the goals of the event. So this is how it drives a bit of integration here. Okay, this is how people start relating through the moderator's questions.
Right. I think Doug's spot on. And even looking beyond games, just looking from a generation standpoint, you can leverage different generations to help be a bridge. For instance, one example we talk about is Generation X, which is sometimes forgotten in the generational discussion. They're known as latchkey kids, but they're the last generation we have in the US that grew up without the internet or pre-internet. But when they were adults, that's when the internet came into kind of its heyday in the 1990s and 2000s. And so they kind of got the best of both worlds. And so oftentimes they can help be a great bridge between the baby boomers who did not grow up with the internet and all this technology and millennials and Generation Z. And so just as games are a great way to connect people, you can also use different age groups to help build those bridges between different generations.
That's terrific. I love that. That correlates actually with some work we're doing with another client about communicating with your adult children as you enter a certain period of life, and making it clear about your boundaries and their boundaries. And I just wrote an article for her actually about good boundaries are essential in order to have good communication. You have to have that level of respect that comes from each person being very clear about what they want and saying what they really mean instead of what they think the other person wants to hear, and things like that. So it all fits into the same type of concern, Zac. I like that very much, what you just said.
Well, thank you. And I think to add on to that, I think part of what makes Doug and I's approach unique looking at generations is that we try to look at from a positive point of view. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes we get wrapped up with some of these stereotypes where it's like some of the older generations might be like, well, these younger folks are lazy. They don't want to work. They don't know how to work like I did when I was younger. Some of the younger folks might be like, well, these older people, they don't get technology. They don't understand us. But again, by looking at it in terms of generational strengths, so stuff that generations are really good at based on the circumstances that shape them, the weaknesses they have, so stuff they might not be as good at, but then opportunities, so ways to leverage them in the workplace. And what's interesting is that when you map out all the generations and you put all their strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities together, they all cancel out. And so by working together across all age groups, you get that net positive that we're all looking for in the workplace.
Yeah. And another benefit of that is that sometimes a perceived weakness is actually a strength that the other generation may not possess. And like you just said, avoiding the judgment of one generation by another is key to having the opportunity that's presented there through those differences to be something you can really work with.
Right. I
Yes.
think that's a great point. And there's also other tools that we talk about beyond using games. One example is an affinity diagram. So you get a group of people together, you have them brainstorm, and then you map it out on a whiteboard or a virtual board. And then you look for similarities or commonalities.
Mhm.
And it's a way to help map out ideas, but you can also include people, regardless of if they're younger or older folks. Doug, do you want to elaborate maybe another tool that folks can use to connect beyond games?
Yeah, there's quite a variety of different tools. The Zach mentioned the affinity process, where you basically have post-it notes that can be done virtually as well. There's a number of tools that do that. Another tool that can be used is a brainstorming kind of framework. Okay, maybe you've heard of the fishbone analysis or Ishikawa diagram or cause and effect diagram. That diagram can be used in a lot of places, not just finding the causes of a problem. It can be used in terms of finding solutions to a cause. You turn it around and run it the other way. Some of the other tools, if you've got a lot of things you have to sort through, and you're not sure which one is the driver and which one is the driven. We've probably all been there. Got a whole bunch of ideas, got a laundry list. Well, if you position all your ideas in a circle with space in between, and you draw an arrow from each one of those ideas to the ones that it drives, okay, you end up with what looks like a cat's cradle of arrows going back and forth across the circle. But if you count the number of arrows going in and the arrows going out of each one of these things around the edge of the circle, you can now have a proportion which tells you, is this a beginning step? Is this a middle step? Or is this a final step? This enables you to, come up with some kind of a schedule. So that's just a couple of tools. Zach?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And another tool we talk about is the force field analysis. So you take a idea or stereotype you have. So one example might be, they're not listening to me. And then maybe an alternate statement would be, let's try a different way. Like, let's do texting. Let's do like a live stream like this. Try other methods. Another one, and I think Doug pointed this out. If it's not broke, you can't fix it. And so, an alternate way to look at that would be, there's always new approaches that we could use to improve our workplace.
Again, the idea behind that is, the negative phrases you hear all the time. Okay, just put them on one side. But then come up with positive things on the other side. Betty, maybe you've seen some of that in a communication development approach. People are always negative and you want to be positive. Well, how can people exercise their positive lobe on their brain?
Well, first they have to decide to do that. That's often the biggest hurdle, is because they're stuck in the idea that there has to be something wrong. And that's not solutions-oriented thinking. But when you start, instead of thinking that there's a problem, say, okay, what's the opportunity here to change something? Then you have, the beginning of a different kind of discussion going on.
Betty, you've nailed something that I believe a younger generation can help immensely. Younger generations tend not to be as negative,
right,
in my experience. So if you give them a voice and you listen to them, okay, and Zach's point about not looking at the negative side of these generations, don't look at it as a generation gap. Look at it as a generation opportunity, because that's really what it is.
Yep, that's right. Are you going to call it a problem or an opportunity? The choice is yours.
Right. Well, and to build on both those points, if we look at where we are today, All the generations we have are living longer than they used to. And so what we have is we have more generations working at the same time than we used to. And today we've got 5 different generations that are all working at the same time, ranging from the silent generation, so folks that were kids when the Depression and World War II happened, all the way to Generation Z, being kids born, in the shadow of 9/11 or in the late 1990s and 2000s. And, with each of those generations, they bring unique strengths and weaknesses to the workplace. But if we step back and look at our world as a whole, our change cycles are occurring faster than they used to. But then also our world's more complicated. And so there's that opportunity where we all need to work together to be successful in the future.
Yep. Amen to that. Amen to that.
Let's invite Joe to make a comment here. Joe,
Yeah.
what do you think about this?
As a person who runs a cooperative with people of many, many different age groups and many, many different backgrounds, I think the most powerful tool to get people on the same mission is aligning vision through things like story and making sure that people are getting a message or they're behind something. I find that every generation, every single type of person that you work with, if there's a hope and a vision and something meaningful behind what you're working on, everyone seems to want to get behind it and line up. And there's obviously different, more efficient ways or less efficient ways to communicate and how you align everyone. But the core of it is, if you could get quality vision and communicate that out to people, they all tend to line up no matter what background they are, no matter what their personal story is. But there seems to be a common thread that if you want people to get on the same page, vision through story seems to be the play that works unilaterally across all generations.
That's an interesting point. One of the areas that Doug helped me think about when looking at generations was motivation. And he introduced me to some of Daniel Pink's work looking at motivation. And some of the areas he focuses on, the first one is mastery. So trying to get good at something, autonomy. So having the space to do stuff, but then also purpose. So having a understanding of what you do. And what Doug and I had found is that for younger generations, for millennials and Generation Z, they're more driven by purpose. So they want to know the why behind what they're doing and how it makes a difference. For Generation X and some millennials, mastery is what drives them. So they want to get good at what they're doing over time. And then for some of the older generations, for the silent generation and baby boomers and perhaps some of Generation X, autonomy is what drives them. They want to have the space to do stuff and the resources to be successful. But I think, just as Joe was saying, I think that, across all generations, they want to understand that why and the vision. But it's interesting to see that for some, they have a greater focus on that than others.
Joe, you mentioned stories. Stories is an important thing. And it's marvelous to see your son there, Joe. That's great. I just love it. I know it's late there. Okay. So the thing is, all of us learned the world through stories. And Zac and I we've actually written a number of stories to be included in our upcoming book. Stories are how you change people's mental map. That's what I find. You can do PowerPoints all you want, but telling a story is how people change. And I think if you play a game with a group of people, you're not telling a story, you're essentially writing one. You're creating a story with this group of people, which is one of the more powerful things, I think, about using games between generations.
That's really interesting. On the note of storytelling with generation. I've got a real life example, I guess, that happened quite recently. Um, what had happened was we had a cooperative meeting, and everyone was in the room, and we were ideating around the messaging behind one of the products that we had, and and there was a comment that was made about the product, which was valid, right? But it was a little bit negative about the product, and that was coming from someone that was my generation, so it was a millennial that said it. And then the person who heard it, he was a bit older, nearly in his 60s. And after that meeting, we had conversations, and you could tell that there was a bit of animosity around that. It's like a little bit of negativity around it. Now, these two individuals had a one-to-one a bit later on, and then the next time that I'm sitting down with the older party, he's very positive about this person. What I found out was that there was some storytelling between them, just shared experiences and telling about things in their lives, and they had found some commonality and some vulnerability, and all of a sudden something that could have turned into, I don't really like that guy, I don't want to work with that guy, I don't like what he has to say and how he says it, goes into, yeah, he had some amazing feedback, and I really need we got to talk to him more and get what he has to say on board. It's just astonishing that the key point there, that went from the negative to the what can we learn, what's the opportunity, as Betty was talking about, was there was a story in between, and that story was what loosened everything up, and allowed perspective to open up and build rapport and trust. So, real life things happening that it's just black and white difference between how people saw each other across generations, and mutual respect came from the telling of a story. I thought that was pretty wild.
Wow, that's interesting. It's crazy to look and see how games can be used to bring people together, but also in a business sense. Joe, I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about how you use gamification in your organization or with your clients?
Yeah, I can talk about gamification. One of the systems that was mentioned earlier here, where we talked about using an avatar, we use a system called gather.town. Might be similar to what was being used, but we use it for what I guess I call structural gamification. So the way in which we do meetings in a place like that where there's an avatar, and then there are practical benefits to the organization, and one of those benefits are reducing things like Zoom fatigue. So if I'm in Zoom meetings all day, I just find it absolutely exhausting. Every Zoom meeting overlaps into the next, and you might end up being 2 minutes late to this, and just that's not a good look. But it's something where keeping track of time in a virtual world becomes quite challenging. You've got to manually check the time, and that's a learned skill, right? When you're working in a real office, someone knocks on your door, or you can see them in the glass outside the boardroom, and so you know that the next meeting is meant to start. And I find that in a gamification platform, we've got an avatar, and you're in a virtual office. You can do things like having people come in and the next person's here for the meeting, and then they walk into the meeting room and say, oh, you're my next meeting, I want you to meet this person. And you create the sense of like, when you're having an interaction in a real office, a new person comes in and then meets that person, that overlap is valuable, and it helps you transition between meetings without the, oh, I got my next call on, which is very clinical, and into a, hey, this is Bob, he's actually here for my next meeting. If you want to say hi, I reckon you guys can get to know each other. It'd be great for you guys to talk. Why don't we get your email and you guys can chat? And so the transition becomes better. So it helps with time management. It helps with transitions. And I've just seen a little comment about live interruptions. The office can be both good and bad. The good thing is, in the digital world, I think a lot of people are nice enough not to interrupt in the same way that they interrupt in a real office. So in a real office, it's like it's a knock on the door. But in this sort of circumstance, you could see maybe someone's avatar walk into the office as well, without it actually fully interrupting what's going on inside of a closed room. So there's all sorts of cool things that objectively could be better than some of the things that we do in person. And from a structural standpoint, replacing Zoom, let's say, with an avatar-based virtual office space is really cool. And things like going into a breakout room where instead of pressing a button to go into a box and a new bunch of boxes come up, you could physically walk over to a desk or a workspace with other people. And so that tactile way of doing things helps with people that just maybe can't visualize what it looks like to go into a breakout room. Because for me, I find that quite understandable. I can imagine that some people who have a different way of looking at things could potentially find that to be impersonal, right? Yeah, a bunch of boxes and faces, but like I can walk over to someone, I see them, and then it brings up their camera, and that feels really nice. There's something to that tactile experience, which is less fatiguing, but also practical in many ways, and we really enjoy what that does for our business. And probably the final point on that particular structural side of gamification is I had a conversation with someone recently, and he used a system like that, the exact same system we use, Gather Town, with a bunch of friends because he was feeling lonely. Mm-hmm. Now, being in Zoom rooms all day with people, let's say, like while you're working, like let's say I'm working on a project on Google Docs and I've got work to do and I'm feeling a bit isolated and lonely because I'm by myself working from home. But, you could maybe have someone in a Zoom room together with you and with the camera off or something, but that's not very personal either. But if you're in a room and there's other people in the office, you're not alone, even though you may not be in interaction with them, but they're there. And I get that when I've got, let's say, one of my team members doing interviews. So there's a person in an interview while team members interviewing them. I'm having a meeting over here, or I'm just doing work on my computer. And I can see on the side there that people are there. It definitely feels far less isolating. And it clearly tricks my brain and his brain too, the person who brought it up to me, to feel like you're in a space with other people, even though physically you're not. So I see huge benefit to what my company calls the structural integration of gaming to replace sort of systems and things with tools that have a gamification element. It feels like a Super Mario game or something like that. I've got another type of gamification to talk about, but I think I'll pause on that to let everyone else speak. But that's my personal experience in my organization with what I call structural gamification.
Wow. Well, that's incredible. Well, thank you. And I think you bring up a good point, and it's something Doug and I have looked at, starting with millennials, moving on to Gen Z and Alpha, with all the technology. And you had mentioned that it's made it where for those younger generations, they could have friends that are virtually anywhere, as long as they have an internet connection, the right technology. And so, they're not limited by physical boundaries or even like nation state boundaries. Even myself, like I have online friends that I've never met in person, and they're from all over the world. At the same time, the sad part is that as we've had these online tools, it's changed how we think about relationships. And so with, I think, millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, they have more relationships through technology, but they're more shallow. So they don't have the depth that an in-person one would have. And I think that's going to be a big concern in the future, because imagine if we have all this technology and you're not even really interacting with the person day to day, that could drive loneliness, anxiety, depression. The sad part is, even if you look at Gen Z, the suicide rate has been high, because for some of these kids, their whole life, they feel like they're compared to the rest of the world and to some kind of image that's not sustainable for ordinary folks. So I think that's a challenge. But as you mentioned, there's also an opportunity using some of these tools to create those online communities to connect people.
I'm kind of reminded here that hate to refer to a bad comedy movie, okay, but in the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, okay, I think you guys have probably seen that. Most of you probably have. There's this tagline they go through again and again: "Be excellent to each other." And it's a throwaway thing. It seems nonsensical, but it's important, I think, to be excellent to those we work with virtually, to build them up. Joe, I'm impressed with what you're doing. I've never heard of structural gamification, but now you've introduced me to a new word. Thank you. Betty, talking about it's as important. People have ways to communicate, but they also have to want to communicate, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a key piece of this.
Mm-hmm.
And Zac, Zac and I working together, looking at these different generations. One of the things we noticed was that each of these generations has different values. There are values shifts that take place between them. Sometimes they're quite small, and sometimes they're very large. And the issue with different values is that it's hard to. How do you reconcile someone who's got completely different values than you? Okay, do you even want to talk to them? How do you reach people who have different value structures? Well, I think one key piece that we all have to learn is we have to value each other. We have to approach others from the point of view that these people intend good things. And that's a formal piece of it. You can't approach others with the idea that they mean ill, because that you're never going to communicate in that kind of role.
Mm-hmm. That is absolutely true. If you want to change someone's mind, you have to meet them where they are and present to them something that means something to them. Otherwise, they're just going to tune you out. And going back to what Zac mentioned a few moments ago about Gen Z feeling that there's this image that they are somehow failing to live up to. I think that response and that reality for that generation, and they're coming out and expressing what's been going on for generations. That there's a group of what I would have to call false values that is broadcast as though they are real, and people have bought into that with their entire lives. And we're now coming to a time in history where all of those things need to change for many reasons, including our ability to maintain as a species to start with. But also, I think that one of the things that's really cool about the younger generation is that coming out and saying my personal happiness is important and it's a primary value, and without guilt about that, even while they're still having the experience of feeling undervalued because they're not buying into the idea that they need to be an asset to consumerism in some way in order to have value. And that, to me, that's what that whole thing of the materialism that has been broadcast incessantly and that so many people have bought into on so many levels. I think that that is a cultural shift that we're beginning to experience, and it's well overdue. And so I really think that the kids are on something very real.
Right. I think you're spot on. And I think often in the context of the workplace, when we listen to those needs that different generations have, especially the emerging one that's just entering the workforce, we often find that by doing what we can to support them, that we benefit the other generations too. For instance, with millennials and Gen Z, they put a lot of emphasis on work-life integration, having flexibility. And with COVID, with virtual or hybrid work settings. That's what we're seeing that's commonplace today. And we had the stuff to do it prior to the pandemic, but there was a big need for that because of a catastrophic event that happened, but also generations that were gradually pushing for that. And so I think often when we hear some of this stuff from generations, we should look at as opportunities to not only help them, but help others. And then I think, to go to your other point, one of the challenges that I feel like I see in our society today is that with a lot of this technology and getting stuff instantly, it's really easy to judge people. It's very easy to look at someone and be like, oh, this person liked this post, or they're connected with that, or they have this online or that, so I'm just not going to talk to them. In reality, we need to take the time to listen to people. And, as Doug had mentioned earlier, if you step back, and this is one of the main points we try to bring up in all of our talks, regardless of where you are in your life, we all have similar goals. We want to be good at what we do. We want to make meaningful connections with people, and we want to be successful. We want to leave some kind of legacy. And often I think that starts with having an open mind, but then also seeing what opportunities you could have from other people. For instance, with Doug and I, we met through a mutual associate, and, from meeting him, he's added a whole nother depth to this generational discussion that I didn't have. And then I think for myself, I got to teach him about some of these emerging trends or current trends, and help him learn stuff like playing Minecraft. And it's a case where with that intergenerational learning, we've both become better people because of it.
Yeah, that's what this is all about. Is each group has something to contribute that's unique. Their own experience can add to the experiences that others have had, and give perspective for what kind of meaning can be made out of those experiences.
Something that Zac and I have seen when we started looking at the makeup of the workplace in terms of what generations are there. And we went back 1960, what did the Census Bureau say? 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. And where's it going in 2030? What's really interesting is that we are in this world to stay. We used to have, say, 3 generations in the workplace. We now have 5. And it doesn't look like that's going to change. That's the way it's going to be. So the old paradigms that we've inherited from, the World War II generation of, you should sit down and shut up and listen to your elders. Okay, I'm overstating.
You're not.
That doesn't work. Okay, that absolutely doesn't work. And we can't. We need to change policies that have been written into our organizations by these older generational values, and we need to write policies that reflect the values of the generations that are here now and who's going to be here in the future. Zac and I have talked a lot about this. The idea that a person should be loyal to their company. Okay, that concept. That was true of older generations, and it started to break apart for the boomers, my generation, and it doesn't exist today. Well, ask yourself, why doesn't that exist? What actions in the workplace have taken away that loyalty? Is it just that these new generations are faulty somehow? I don't think so. Loyalty is based on trust. Trust is a two-way street. If the company is not loyal to its employees, they will not be loyal to the company. I think that's a big lesson that we are seeing today.
Right. I think Doug's spot on. And, And something else to think about, and this might sound counterintuitive, but embracing this generational diversity is actually good for business. There were some Forbes studies done that said that diverse and inclusive teams and organizations make better decisions 87% of the time. And then not only that, you can tap into all these different perspectives, which can help drive innovation, creativity, and then help an organization thrive in the future. And then the other part too is to think about your customer base. For instance, like let's say I had a company that mostly served younger folks, but my employees are older folks. Well, it's going to be harder to connect with them if I don't have people there that can relate to them. And the reverse could be true too. So having that mix of older and younger folks can help you better connect to those different customer segments and then be successful longer term.
Yeah, that's resilience. That's being able to adapt to different market forces and personal concerns and the dynamics of how the company runs, using the insights from the various groups of people, generations or any other marker that you want to use. That just makes sense because the marketplace is incredibly diverse and continuing to become more so as the communications web evolves. So the more points of view you can bring into it, the better you can come up with a point of reference that is relevant to the entire situation.
Right, I think that's spot on. Joe, do you want to jump in with your thoughts on this?
I've got two thoughts. I put them in the comments here relating to what you were saying and what Doug was saying. I'll start with what you were saying about the nature of connections for younger generations and whatnot. And the note I wrote here is that everything's very transactional now. It's very easy to get new likes, new followers, new friends. It's very easy to buy things and get things delivered instantly and things like that. And going deep doesn't present an instant gratification like a lot of other things do. Like, it's really nice to make a new friend on Facebook, have a conversation, and then say, that's my friend. And our systems are tricked into thinking, I have friends. Now, I think we know that going deep is the way, right? If we're building shallow, meaningless relationships, that's problematic. If you could have lots of friends and feel terribly lonely because you have friends, if you get what I'm saying here. And there would have been a time, like if I imagine when I was a kid, like when you're in school, your friends are your friends. They're there in front of you. You got to make it work. If you see some friends connected with this friend, yeah, you had some interactions like, oh, I don't want to talk to that person because they're friends with them and whatnot. But it wasn't quite as bad as it is right now, where it's like that person has that political view or something, and we can't interact. We won't even hear what they have to say. And it's like that really makes it super easy to not be incentivized to go deeper, because going deeper is not necessarily trained or structurally supported. Where if you're in an institution like a school, or you're in a job where you stay for a long time, it starts to become intuitive that you go deep. But right now, you can just leave your job, right? You could just go find a new job, or you could change schools, or you could hang out in a new community. And the ease at which that can be done creates the intuition that this can be transactional. You can find a new partner, right? You can find a new friend. All these things can just be found, and the instant gratification of that validates it. Even though, if you really think about it, going deep creates meaningful connections and actual real friends. But the question is that trained? Like, do you need to learn that now? Like, does there need to be a level of education that people are taught through the course of their lives now? that was intuitively given to younger, the older generations were given to it by the structure they lived in and the way things were. That doesn't exist anymore. So I think it's quite challenging for younger generations who don't have the institution or the structure through which the things that I know as an older individual than someone that's say in their 20s is important. But can I really expect them to know that, given their experiences are totally different to mine? And I'm going to pause on that to let everyone else comment. But that's my first comment on what Zac was saying, and then I'll talk to Doug's point after this.
It's interesting. You talked about quote unquote friend, and I think with technology we've changed what that means. I think if you look at generations pre-internet, they would define friendship much differently than we do today, where someone might be like, "Oh, I'll add you as a friend on Xbox, or I'll follow you on Twitter or Facebook," and while some of that stuff is great, it's very shallow. I think the other part too is recognizing the fact that it takes work. You've got to be there for your friends. You've got to invest time. Just like when I met Greg, like I didn't jump on his podcast the next day. I got to know him and Bonnie, and then we had calls together. We connected people to each other. So we built a good working relationship over time. And I think that's an excellent point you bring up, Joe, is that it's important to look and see with each generation, what are some of those skills that could be lost that the prior generation knew, and then creating those programs or mentoring so that way they don't forget that. And I think to my earlier point about Generation X, I think that's why they'll be important for the next 20 or 30 years, because they're the last generation that grew up in that pre-internet environment. And I think they'll especially be critical advisors for millennials and Gen Z. Because if you look at the next 20 to 30 years, it's essentially going to be Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z trying to figure out what to do with the world as the baby boomers and silent generation retire.
Really important to what you said there is, okay, Doug didn't just keep showing up to your office every day, right? Like if Doug shows up to your office, there is the automation of a relationship that gets created. You had to go out of your way to say, I believe that communicating with this person and going deeper is the right thing to do. And that's beyond the instant gratification of making a new connection and meeting a new person. Like, that's something you had to do. And, if you didn't have the insight to feel that that was important, because it's not necessarily intuitive, then, then it doesn't happen. So it's pretty interesting that what you did was actually you broke intuition and you did something that wasn't structurally supported. You did something different. And I think, how can we expect people to know to do that? I don't think there's a rule book or a manual that said you're in an online interaction. Like, okay, you can go to networking meetings and meet 50 people in a day and book a one-to-one and then never see them again. And that's not necessarily the right thing to do, but who says it isn't? Most things just say network like crazy, meet lots of people, but you didn't do that. You networked and then you went deep. And I just don't think that that's structurally supported by the way the internet and the way things work right now. I think you have to manually go out of your way and say, this is how I choose to work. And I think that there's definitely a gap there between how people intuitively think they need to act based upon the instant gratification of meeting lots of people versus what you know and have demonstrated, which is it was required for you to go deeper, for you to actually like grow the tree. Don't cut down the sapling. You're trying to grow a tree here that can bear fruit, right? You know something that other people don't and don't necessarily represent the way they interact.
Well, that's a whole field of interpersonal training that I think is going to be an important feature for people to learn to understand all the different levels of interaction that there are. There's the superficial you just mentioned, Joe, of you just go out there and throw out some contact and see if anything happens, and then maybe do. But how do you actually create a lasting relationship, a friendship, a fruitful collaboration? You have to make the effort. You have to understand what it makes that important, and not only for yourself, but for the other party, for whatever energy it is that you're wanting to create through what you do together, and in the long run for the world. So that type of interpersonal skill is something that's being redefined as the entire communication environment is shifting and changing.
Right, that's spot on. And I think it's little things, and I think kind of a broader takeaway from this conversation is that we all have opportunity, regardless of what generation we're in, to be that positive change agent, to go out and interact with older or younger folks, and do positive stuff. And earlier we had that conversation that Doug mentioned about loyalty. I saw that at a past organization. I would see people just leave or get ready to leave, and something I did that I thought was important was to try to show people appreciation. And so for some of the people I'd worked with that were getting ready to leave, I would send them messages and say, hey, by the way, I heard you're leaving. I want you to know I enjoyed working with you on ABC, and I wish you the best for the future. And I was shocked at the responses I'd get. People would be like, wow, like no one told me this. Or if colleagues I knew would get promoted, I'd send them a note, hey, just want to congratulate you on that promotion or your birthday. Doing small stuff like that and showing appreciation, that's how we make a better world. And that's how we make our workplace a positive place. And honestly, I think that's what we all want. But I think as Joe had mentioned, we treat a lot of these relationships as transactional. And it's like, even if we know we're not going to be somewhere for 30 years, why not make it the best experience we can for a millennial or a Gen Z or whoever for the 3 to 5 years they're there? So that way, when they leave, they'll be like, wow, I grew this much. I had an incredible experience. And by the way, I'd recommend this employer to other people.
Yeah. That's right. That's business, good business sense. It's good ethics. And, if you're trying to create loyalty, back to that point of, if you want to create loyalty, you have to be loyal to your employees. You can't just treat them like a disposable commodity.
Right. Well, and you're maintaining your network too.
Yeah.
Because you never know when you'll work with these people again, and it creates more options for stuff. Doug, did you want to jump in? I think I might have cut you off on accident.
No, you didn't. I think that part of this idea that companies have that they can always get more people. Okay, those days are gone. Okay, that was true 1970s, 1980s, 1990s to some extent. There were lots of people out there. They were well trained. You could bring them in. You didn't need to train. You didn't need to do knowledge management. Okay, so those days are gone. Now people leave quickly, and it's now a challenge for companies. They have to change their long-standing HR policies and practices, the ones that they've seen useful for decades. They're no longer useful. So they have to change.
Right. Well, and I think to add to another point, just as adults have seen that structural change in how loyalty is perceived in the workplace, believe it or not, kids have seen it too. And so you go back pre-internet, information was more filtered. It wouldn't always be out there for the whole world about stuff. And when millennials came into the workplace, when the internet was emerging, people would type stuff on the internet, hey, I had this bad experience, and companies were shocked. And so you've got to think today, you've got millennials, Generation Z and Generation Alpha. They have all this information. They can see what all these companies are doing. And in some ways, they don't like it, or they don't like what they're seeing. As Doug had mentioned, there are these outdated policies from the greatest generation. And so for younger folks, it makes them very cynical. It makes them wonder, is the company really looking out for me? And if they can do stuff to show that they are, that'll encourage them to stay and grow. And it's like, even if they don't stay forever, you'll at least get the benefit of them while they're there. And as Doug had mentioned, looking at the future, families have continued to get smaller over time, going back even to the baby boomers. And so if you've got a future where there's less people, it's more important to retain the people you have, but then also show appreciation, so that way they won't jump ship and then you lose all that institutional knowledge.
Yeah, that's definitely speaking to what that future environment is going to be, much more centered on valuing the skill sets and the experience of the people that are already present, instead of just like Doug said, oh, there's just so many people, you can just like run through them. That's not an option anymore.
Right, and there's not. Joe, did you want to jump in? You mentioned that you had a second point you wanted to make. I think it was related to loyalty.
Yeah, there is, because it's along all these lines here. I see a bigger problem, right? From there's an employer problem of retaining talent and whatnot from that perspective. I also see a challenge for the younger generation with loyalty in regards to what's the point. I think there's at least millennials, at least I think there's a bit of nihilism in us, because we're starting to get a little bit jaded to things. Younger generations don't really carry that as much because they haven't been around to see how things go. But the idea that you would stick with an employer, there was a contract. If I stick with an employer for long enough, at least let's say in Australia has always been a place where you could do a normal job, stay in it for a very long time. You buy a house, you have children, you live a good life, you go to your holiday once a year. There was always that contract that said you'll be fine. And I think a lot of that's disappearing on two levels. The contract is broken. Work a job, stay in and be committed and be loyal. And you're not guaranteed to have a house, and you're not guaranteed to have a quality retirement. My generation can see it. It's almost like, what is the point of giving my loyalty to this company when I'm really restricted to this narrow vision of what I might get in a future, and it's no longer guaranteed because the bar keeps moving. So we got a social contract that says the life I live, the work I do, that as long as I'm a good worker and I have my place in society, that I'll be looked after. And I think that contract is no longer valid and isn't really compelling what we're going to get out of it, because the bar has also moved on what we see we can have. That it's like, okay, I've got a free flow of information that shows me the kind of life I could be living, or that lives other people are living. So I'm being told that loyalty is good. Meanwhile, I don't really see why this gives me any value, because I'm in a transactional world. And if I did go deep and I go down that journey, where do I end up? Maybe being able to afford to buy a house at some point so that I don't have to worry about rent to raise my family. And it's like, well, if you've got this two-phased or two-sided change where I'm getting this new information and I'm getting these new desires of things I want to do in life, like that are not being met by, let's say, having that loyalty, and I'm also not really getting as good a deal from that loyalty in the first place. I think both sides just are disconnected. The people with the companies, who are perhaps older, from older generations, and have this expectation of the young person, and the young person that's like, how is this valuable? I don't get this. So I think there's a big misunderstanding across the generations of who own the companies that people are working at, and the people who are doing the labor into those companies. I'll bring it back to you guys, but I see it as a millennial. I'm like in the middle of that, but I could see the younger generations, it would be even worse.
Right. Well, and I think you bring up a good point that in the past, people were seen more as cogs in a machine.
Yeah.
So the workplace was more mechanical, more industrial driven. But today, in the fourth industrial revolution, going on the fifth one, it's important to bring out the best in your people. So tapping into their inner strengths, their creativity, looking at them more as a co-creator. So how can they help create something at your workplace or community that could benefit others, being able to collaborate with people and then work across different stakeholder groups to be effective. And those require more soft skills, being your authentic self. That is much different than perhaps the world that Doug was working in early in his career. And I think especially for managers and leaders, they've got to realize that with all this information out there, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they've gotten really good at filtering it. And so they can tell when someone's not being authentic or when someone's not being consistent, not doing what they say they're going to do. And, if organizations do that, they're going to see these younger generations run away from them because they're not going to tolerate that hypocrisy.
Yeah.
That's agreed. Well, we're running longer than expected, you guys. I think I'm going to have to run along here. But Greg wants to know, when is your book coming out? Tell us that.
Oh, the big question. Well, we haven't chosen a publisher yet. Okay. I don't know how long these things generally take, but I'm thinking it's going to be longer than we expect.
Yes.
So I would have to say, Zach, if you pull a date out of the air, what are you thinking? September?
I think
October?
we're aiming for sometime in the fall. And that brings me to another point. I did want to thank everyone for this opportunity for Doug and I to be on here. It's always great to see Greg and his wife, Bonnie. Betty, it's been awesome to see you again. Joe, same for you in Australia. It's great to hear an international perspective on this stuff because Doug and I have mostly focused on the U.S. And, once again, thanking Doug for working with me on all this, being a part of this journey. And, I just really appreciate these broadcasts. For everyone listening, feel free to tune in once a week. They've got awesome guests on here. And for everyone listening, I hope you have a great weekend.
Indeed. You said it all, Zach.
Yeah, you said it all, Zach. Yeah, thank you, everybody, for being here. This was a fabulous conversation we had. And I think we're going to have to take up the next one when the book comes out. We'll do it again. So this has been amazing. So thank you very much, and enjoy your weekend, everyone.